Hello world, you're listening to STRATEGIKON, the podcast of Sage International Australia, SIA, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the decision by the Trump administration to formally recognize Jerusalem as Israel's undivided capital, going against the opinion of the broader international community. If there is one thing that unites the Middle East, Arab and non-Arab, Sunni, Shiite, Sufi, and other branches of Islam, it's the issue of Palestine. If there's one thing that is guaranteed to change the balance of power in the Middle East, it is the issue of Palestine. Long off the international agenda, Palestinian rights have been unloaded on whatever passes as Israeli internal security, essentially since 9/11. The US and the world has been so caught up with the scourge of Islamist terrorism and counterinsurgency that it was content not to revisit a problem that, barring a major war, had no fair or just solution. The belief that Israel will pull back to the 1967 border, giving the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority, is now farcical. Israeli settlers, backed by the Israeli government, have stripped away and divided Palestinian territory in a way that would make the voluntary removal of Israeli settlers from the best, most fertile and strategically advantageous lands on the West Bank impossible. Israel's government, while touted as the only democracy in the Middle East, has narrowed its focus on pleasing its own politico-religious extremists who believe that a greater Jewish state is the only viable future for Israel, that sharing political benefits with Palestinians in the occupied territories and ending Israel's warlike stance against the Arabs and Persians would be akin to letting the barbarians through the gates, a guaranteed form of political suicide. But of course not all Israelis subscribe to extreme Zionist views. Not all want to be the permanent jailers of the Palestinians, whether they live in Gaza or what is left of the West Bank. But the peculiar system of government in Israel, cleverly manipulated by Benjamin Netanyahu and his coterie of extreme right-wing supporters, has sucked the oxygen out of the room. No Israeli wants to be publicly shamed as a self-hating Jew, and no person outside the Jewish faith wants to be accused of anti-Semitism for criticizing Israel's government, even when the Israeli government's moral compass is found wanting. The Muslim and Arab worlds have always believed that occupied East Jerusalem would be the capital of an independent Palestinian state. But for cynics of the Arab-Israeli peace process, the almost willful lack of serious development over the past 17 years was evidence enough that the two-state solution was dead. All that was needed was someone to officiate over its funeral. Perhaps President Trump, a supporter of the more extreme elements of America's influential Jewish lobbyists, was the person for this job. But now, having done that, what will come from America's decision to ignore completely Palestinian wishes that East Jerusalem become the capital of an independent Palestine? What has set this in motion? And will the Middle East rally to the Palestinian cause in a way not seen since the 1973 war? To explore this topic, I am joined by Dr. Imad Harb, who is Director of Research and Analysis at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and a member of the Sage International Australia Advisory Board, as well as SIA's resident existentialist philosopher, David Olney. Welcome back, Imad, and greetings to David.
Hi, good morning, John.
Imad, since President Trump's declaration that he would recognize Jerusalem as Israel's undivided capital and that he'd move the US embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, violence has broken out in the West Bank. Does this portend the beginnings of a third Palestinian intifada?
Well, who knows? So far, what has been sustained since the declaration has been basically a week of disturbances and demonstrations in different parts of the West Bank, also inside 1948 Israel. So whether this is an intifada or not is still to be determined. The concept of intifada has been associated with a much more violent kind of response, with some blood basically being spilled on both sides. So far, it has not happened, although there has been one or two casualties on the Palestinian side and injuries because of Israeli security forces being a little too rough with demonstrators. But so far, the intifada has not taken place, but there is nothing preventing it from taking place.
David, would you like to add something?
Yeah, what I'm very curious about at the moment is, Trump made his statement, but for how long were the Israelis aware that he was going to say something? And for how long were they preparing the security operation to make sure that things were relatively quiet? So that if the Israelis had increased the level of security everywhere, is it a case where the Palestinians could see if they kicked off, it would be a disaster? So what we've got at the moment is a very uncomfortable tension of the Israelis were ready and waiting, and now the Palestinians have to bide their time and look for an opportunity. So what we're really seeing is the pressure building inside a balloon.
You want me to respond to that?
Yes, if you can, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, yeah. Well, as far as the whether they were arranging these things together is, I tend to say yes. There has been coordination on this issue. I don't think that the Trump administration would really declare something like that out of the blue. I think that the Netanyahu government has been waiting for something of this nature to take place, although the president has signed the waiver to move the embassy at least once before. So, yes, in a way, there has been coordination, but the coordination almost is, to me, it's more Israeli directed than it is American directed. I have a feeling that the United States, since the United States State Department has not been involved in the decision, and it appears that the Secretary of State Tillerson has hardly said anything about it, and the State Department seems to have been taken aback by this. This tells me that maybe the White House was just simply responding to Israeli demands or to Israeli demands for action, so to speak, on this issue. Considering that on this specific thing, I think the White House has always basically toed the line of the Netanyahu government. His ambassador in Israel is a settlement advocate, David Friedman. His son-in-law has very, very deep connections to the settlement movement through his father. These people are making decisions for the White House, so to speak. So whether there has been really State Department influence or not, it's definitely a White House decision based on White House political considerations, specifically with relations with the Netanyahu government.
Imad, just continuing on this theme, what was behind President Trump's thinking? I mean, is there a strategic logic that he's reacting to, or, as many of his international critics contend, is this just another in a long series of ill-thought-out judgments by the US president?
Well, the ill-thought-out judgment is definitely there. Usually when you have reasoned judgments, you really have people who know what they're talking about, who know what they're dealing with. This is an administration, this is a White House that is led by somebody who's I'm sorry to say, is totally clueless on anything related to Middle East issues or international issues for that matter. I mean, he lacks the basic knowledge about these issues. So this is why I go back to the previous question of the White House is really towing the Israeli line. The White House doesn't know anything about this, so they're doing this. Now, as for why is it doing this, there has been two different reports on why these people are doing this, and they all have to do with the issue of I don't know if you know about this basically peace plan. There has been a peace plan talked about it's called the outside-in peace plan. Instead of going through the Palestinians, talking to the Palestinians about resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue, there has been an attempt by the Trump administration to come around it the other way around, to come around from the Arab states towards the Palestinians. In other words, you resolve the issue with the Arab states, and the Arab states would push the Palestinians to a certain kind of resolution. So there have been two reports on two different plans that the White House was interested in, and either of these plans would have required that the United States would do something about Jerusalem. In other words, if any of these plans had succeeded, the United States would have had to have issued its declaration on Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel. The first one is something that was talked about that Netanyahu had proposed to the Saudi Arabians through Jared Kushner himself, and built upon a few principles. First, that basically the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, would remain in the West Bank, in control of the West Bank, that Palestinians would have a non-contiguous place where they may have some self-rule, with a small village about 10 kilometers outside of Jerusalem called Abu Dis as a capital for Palestine. And this was reported to have been spoken of by Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, with President Mahmoud Abbas, when he invited him back in November to go to Riyadh to talk about it. And the plan was just simply rejected outright by Mahmoud Abbas. The second report spoke of, and it appeared in the American Conservative, another plan basically that that Netanyahu had floated that plan a while back, but wasn't talked about it too much, that Palestine, the Palestinian state, is actually already in existence, and it's called the Gaza Strip. In other words, Israel had withdrawn from the Gaza Strip. This is an independent space where there is no Israeli occupation, so it is under Palestinian control, and the Palestinian state would be there, and the West Bank would continue to be populated or colonized or settled by the Israelis, and Mahmoud Abbas would be compensated by, and this is also through Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, compensated with $10 billion of economic assistance to this new state, and also a little, basically almost like, well, not almost, but definitely a bribe to Abbas himself personally, and he too rejected this thing. So both of these things required that Israel would get Jerusalem as its capital by the White House. And once the White House reasoned that once we get that Jerusalem is Israel's capital principle out of the way, then the Palestinians would find that they really don't have anything to negotiate over or anything like that. So thus, we'll make the declaration, and everything will be fine after that. It turns out that it's really not what the Palestinians are looking for. It's not what the Palestinians will ever accept, and it's not what the Palestinians, are actually, politically speaking, will be able to even remotely fathom. Giving up East Jerusalem is not something that the Palestinians want to come.
David, question for Imad.
An observation and a question for both of you, really. I wonder if it's not a combination of old school strategy plus cluelessness. In terms of old school strategy, is this really just the next phase of a sort of rise from the ashes of the project for the new American century? If we really look at what Trump's done, it fits with some of the original PNAC documents from the mid to late 1990s, at the period where Clinton was showing some sort of resistance to PNAC, but got on board. We then have sort of Bush Jr.'s administration happily following PNAC doctrine. Obama doesn't do so much. And now we're back to a president who loves the idea of a new American century. But what we're seeing, which is interesting too, is Imad's comment with the State Department before, is the State Department saw the terrible consequences of PNAC and probably doesn't want a bar of it again. So what do you guys think? Is this a combination of a return to an old model plus Trump just wanting to make something happen? So it's a terrible combination of an old strategy and new stupidity?
Well, the latter, I think. An old strategy and new stupidity based on a very, very important consideration, which is whether it is the neocons of the Project for the American Century of the 1980s and 90s, or whether it is the liberals in the American political system, or the current neocons, or the ultra-conservatives in the Trump administration. The issue of Israel is a separate issue. Everybody agrees on certain parameters regarding Israel itself. What is different is that since the 1990s, there has been a change. To me, it's a tectonic change in the people who are considered to be the liberal internationalists, so to speak, of the American political system. Specifically, those people who look at the Middle East as a place where the United States should not interfere, and yet at the same time should keep Israel secure and give Israel what Israel wants, stuff like that, but not go all the way and try to apply what the neoconservatives really wanted to apply. Almost like it's a new kind of liberal orientation to the approach to Israel. Where even the Democratic Party is no longer really as committed as it used to be to Israel. No matter what Israel wants, they'll give it to Israel, because today the old neoconservative ideology is today being challenged specifically by the evangelical Christians, who are really even to the right of the neocons. The evangelical Christians who are actually, they're represented by Mike Pence in the White House now. They are the ones who really would like this issue of Jerusalem being the capital of Israel, because they truly consider that the more they make it, the more violence that takes place, the more it's possible for the great Armageddon, the war of Armageddon happening in the Middle East, and thus the appearance of the Christ. So it is the American century, the neocons, but yet at the same time now it's becoming a little too imbued with specific religious fervor. The issue of not only that we want to protect Israel, we also want war in the Middle East so that the Messiah would appear. So it's even worse than the neocon. And for that matter, the State Department will not touch it with a 10-foot pole, and only the White House is really on board with it.
I'd just like to add something here. I think that religious fervor is playing out in the Knesset. Really, Bibi Netanyahu's greatest support comes from what would be considered right-wing extremists with heavy religious overtones, the Zionist groups, and they come in all different shapes and flavors. But the fact of the matter is that they also are waiting for the end of times, which is a very disturbing construct when you consider that Israel has got the foremost armed force in the region, is a nuclear power of large dimension. Its capacity to burn the region is actually real. But anyway, look, getting on to Israel, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has touted this move to Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel, a victory for the Jewish people and for Israel. And yet it seems a victory the entire Middle East and the rest of the international community is unlikely to accept. What do you think are the deeper international ramifications of this move? Imad.
Well, for one thing, this is something that nobody ever, when you say that Donald Trump is really a failing kind of president, he did not fail in this one. He succeeded in one thing. He unified a rather very, very disunited Arab world. He unified a rather disunited Muslim world. And everybody is condemning this. Even Saudi Arabia, that is supposed to have really try to help him to pass through some sort of a peace deal that the Palestinians are not going to like, was forced to just declare that this is really not the right thing to do. By the way, today the Islamic conference, countries of the Islamic conference met in Istanbul, and they actually went ahead and declared East Jerusalem to be the capital of the state of Palestine. And not only that, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas declared that he believes that America is no longer the honest broker for the peace negotiations. And he called on the Europeans and the United Nations and others to try to play that mediating role. So if Donald Trump wanted to really increase the United States' influence or wanted to really give the Israelis what they really wanted, yes, he may have given the Israelis what they really wanted, but he may have set his own country's role as a mediator in peace negotiations, really far back, and at the same time may have totally subverted everything that's called a peace process. Whatever there is left of that peace process that nobody really has talked about seriously for the last few years.
David?
I think what really interests me at the moment is to go, Trump can't deal with being frustrated. When he gets frustrated, he does ridiculous or extreme things. And this is a wonderful case where his frustration, he hasn't been able to control Iran, he hasn't been able to control Syria, nothing in Iraq has gone as quickly or as effectively as he would like. And suddenly he's like, well, I'm going to do something. And the irony, it seems to me, is now that the Muslim world has got a way to come together, probably with the Europeans and other relatively normal bits of the world, to go, well, actually, no, making this situation worse is not acceptable. This seems the best opportunity for years for the rest of the world to come together, separate from the Americans, to try and work out something more credible to assist the Palestinians. Yeah, Ahmad, do you think there's a sense of cohesion building that the rest of the world just needs to come up with something to help the Palestinians? Obviously the Muslim world is beginning to do this.
Of course, the Europeans are no longer ready to really pay the price for a peace process, that while the United States is the one that influences things on the ground. The Europeans are saying, well, nobody consults us on any of these moves. We don't like the latest move, obviously. They distanced themselves totally from the United States. 14 members of the Security Council distanced themselves from the United States. The international community has rejected everything first of all, this is an illegal act. You cannot give away somebody's home to somebody else and consider it to be a peace deal. First of all, whether it is whether you want to call it Jerusalem is a Palestinian city or not a Palestinian city, at any rate, Resolution 181 dividing Palestine in 1947 recognized Jerusalem to be an open city, a separate entity that is to be negotiated in final status negotiations. So all Donald Trump said, he said that, I only declared that Jerusalem was their capital. I didn't decide on borders. I didn't decide on the legal issues of it or anything like that. And I'm leaving that to the Palestinians, and yet to the Palestinian Israelis to negotiate. And yet his representative of the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said, he just took Jerusalem off the table. So now they can go and meet together and talk about things. Well, if you took Jerusalem off of the table, how are they going to go to sit at the table and negotiate about Jerusalem? It's confusing. It doesn't make sense. Which tells you that there has not really been any thought given to what the repercussions of an act like this would be like. If it is Donald Trump trying to really satisfy his constituency, he promised them this in the presidential campaign, and now he's delivering on a promise. This is so stupid. You can't. That's not how politics works. If you want to, first of all, you should not have promised, because the people, previous presidents who had promised that thing, also were stupid to promise it, and yet they kept postponing the act. They didn't want to do it because of the political and international ramifications of it. So it's. Now, if the Europeans come and say, well, we want to interfere, and this is the biggest problem here, there is no replacement of the United States. This is the tragedy of it. The United States cannot be replaced by the Europeans, because the Israelis are not going to accept anybody except the United States to negotiate, to be the mediator in this. So, as far as I'm concerned, the peace deal is the peace process is definitely dead. One of my colleagues here called it the Oslo Accords, the Oslo era has come to an end. And it actually has come to an end. No matter what they have agreed in Oslo on whatever Palestinian controlled areas in the West Bank or anything like that, I mean, Israel right now can declare the whole West Bank to be part of Jerusalem. What prevents Israel from doing that? It is the force majeure on the ground. It is the one that controls the territory. It is the one with the military force. So what prevents Israel from doing whatever it wants to do? So where is that peace process? No longer there.
And now let's take a break here. You're listening to Strategikon, the podcast of SIA.
שנפתח לה מזל, פגשה אחד גבר ורשל, והיא תלחש לו, מה היא תלחש לו? קח אותי על הגמל. I'm your beauty, you're my beast, welcome to the Middle East. תל אביב, יא חביבי תל אביב, תסתכל כמה לירדים מסביב, עושים לי היי היי בלילה וואי וואי, וסחטן על תל אביב. תל אביב יא חביבי תל אביב, תסתכל כמה לירדים מסביב, עושים לי היי היי בלילה וואי וואי, וסחטן על תל אביב. זורחת שמש בעיר הלבנה, ונועצים בו מבט מכל פינה.
And that was Israeli singer Omer Adam featuring Ariza on their 2015 hit Tel Aviv. Now we'll return to Strategikon episode 41, Jerusalem, Israel's undivided capital and the 2018 Palestinian crisis. So, Imad, is this actually then a strategic victory for the right wing in Israel? And also, you know, for many years now, people have been crowing over the death of the peace process. Now that the final nail has been put into the coffin, you know, there's only the single state issue. I mean, what happens to Israel? How does it digest all of its occupied Palestinian population, right?
This is, exactly. This is the biggest problem and the hugest elephant in the room. Okay, if you do not give if the two-state solution is dead and you do not give the Palestinians their own state, what do? Are you going to have a one binational state for both peoples? Problem is, today it just happens that today in 2017 there is demographic parity between the Palestinians and the Israelis, about 6.5 million of each side. But the Palestinians have, demographically speaking, are supposed to be a majority in that state. So if you do have a one binational state, then the Jews are obviously quickly going to become a minority, and therein lies the problem of that binational state. So this is why everybody is saying, I prefer that the two-state solution go away and the democratic binational state be established, but Israelis are not going to accept that. So, which by default means that the two-state solution is still alive, no matter how dead it is. But how does it come to life? It's alive, but how does it really come to life and get out of being in coma is the biggest question there is. Who's going to bring it out to life? How does it come to life, considering that the Palestinians, that the Israelis are going to reject anything that's called, open Palestinian state with sovereignty and East Jerusalem as its capital, and not have security guarantees or whatever it is that Israel has been requesting for decades now. So to me, this is the hugest kind of confusion today in this issue until either something happens on the Palestinian side, which the Palestinians would just simply roll over and play dead and say, we give up, which is impossible to happen, or something happens within Israel itself. Israel has to come to terms with the Palestinians. It cannot keep thumping its nose and saying that its security, it is the state that's supposed to have everything that it wants. No, Israel has to give in somewhere, and without giving in, without offering the concessions needed, Israel will never live in peace.
David?
It seems to me that we're now at a point where it's two tectonic plates that can't do little moves and little shakes and little earthquakes, and we're just going to watch the ground buckle and bend and pressure build until there's a monumental rupture. And it might be that neither side gives ground, the tension just builds, and it just becomes, sort of unsustainable. And the great fear is that all we see from now is no one knows what to do for a few years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it turns out to be, and then just cataclysm. Because both sides have been stretched to the point of no return, which is the most horrifying thought I can sort of imagine for it.
Exactly, and the other tragic issue with it is, the American administration is trying to coalesce all these people who say that Iran is a threat. We should do something about Iran. I mean, how do you combine all these? How do you unite all these? If you are doing this to their heart, the Arab world's heart is Jerusalem, is the Palestinian cause. I mean, if you do this to Jerusalem, how do you expect them to really be with you wholeheartedly against Iran? Considering also, by the way, that after Israel, Iran is probably the most to benefit out of this decision, because everybody now is going to say, well, Iran has always been right, and Iran is the one on the right path.
Look, I think Palestine seems to be the only issue in the Middle East that, as we've discussed earlier, Arab and non-Arab people in the Middle East and people from across the sectarian Sunni-Shia divide can agree on. It has been 44 years since the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. What is the likelihood of Trump's decision having set the stage for changing the entire balance of power in the Middle East, where former enemies come together and foment state-sponsored terrorism and proxy war aimed at American and Israeli interests? Now, Imad, you and I have discussed the prospect of, problems emerging in the Middle East as a consequence of just having observed how things have developed, especially with the Russian intervention and with a much more interesting situation, dynamic situation happening with regard to Iran and its role. So how do you see all of these kind of confluences and the prospect of strange and peculiar alliances now coming to the fore? I mean, can, for instance, the Palestinian issue bring the Qataris and the Saudis together in an unexpected way? Can Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Egypt coordinate efforts against Israel, whether that be, paramilitary or diplomatic?
It's no matter how important the issue of Palestine is, the current Arab political order, the Arab leaderships as they exist today, are not going to really forego their personal differences, their differences between ideological differences, political differences, whatever they are, for the sake of something called Palestine. Unfortunately, they are more interested in their own domestic stability and their own domestic interest than they are and the justice for the Palestinian people or the resolution of the Palestinian question. Iran will benefit no matter what. Either way, you want to have a front against Israel, Iran will benefit from it. You want to have a war with Israel, Iran will benefit. You want to have peace with Israel, Iran will not go with you. And becomes the only state in the Middle East that is really confronting Israel. See, here at the center of the Arab Center, Washington, we conducted a poll only about 2 months ago to measure where is Palestine among Arabs. We conducted the poll in about 8 Arab countries, making up about half the population of the Arab world. 88% of these people, of the respondents, said that Palestine is a personal issue for them. Palestine is at the heart of every Arab, and no matter what the Arab political order does or does not do, Palestine will always be central. So, whether the Saudis have a coalition with the Israelis, finally open up on the Israelis and the Emiratis, by the way, with the assistance of the Jordanians and the Egyptians, whether Iran is confronted by all these states combined, whatever it is. Right now, what we are witnessing is the dissolution, so to speak, of the status quo order. And the status quo order is too weak to mount anything effective, and yet not weak enough to totally collapse. So now we have an era of just fluidity in political and strategic terms. Everybody is saying, well, this guy or this state is our friend, that state is our enemy, and all that. But nobody is capable of doing anything about it. Even in the GCC itself, all these 3 countries, Bahrain, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, do not dare approach Qatar, although Qatar is this little tiny state. They can beat it, but they won't dare do it. So all these people, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, UAE, may coalesce to form a front against Iran. But do you really think that they're going to confront Iran? These are really very, very big issues that these people are trying to tackle without necessarily knowing how to tackle it and without necessarily having the capability to tackle them properly. So, what I am expecting is that for the next probably 10, 12, 20, 30 years, who knows, there will be an era of total fluidity. Nobody knows where things are going. There is total confusion about this, while at the same time societies keep on seething. Societies keep on facing new social and economic problems. The Arab political order gets weaker and weaker and weaker until finally something emerges. What that something is, we don't know. It tried to emerge 6 years ago with the Arab Spring, but apparently that too failed. So nobody really knows what will come out to.
David?
Very similar thinking to Ahmad, that realistically here we're seeing regimes in the Arab world that can't or won't take action, but populations who are going to go, why do we have the leaders we have? Why do we have the ineffective system? So at a personal level, Israel's behaviour will offend and motivate, but the majority of Arabs won't be able to do anything directly against Israel, but in the long run they might be able to do something against their own regime. So Israel has, in a sense, now got time to sit and watch and wait and see which society can transform most effectively and completely and potentially become dangerous, and to be there at the beginning to interfere as soon as it possibly can. And as long as Iran can stay the biggest, most capable country in the region, everyone will look to it to go, well, how dangerous are you? Might you be on our side? But the idea of the Arab world coming together against Iran it just doesn't seem likely, because at the moment the Iranians have such an advantage. So again, from the outside, we sit and look at the Arab world again and just throw our hands in the air, going, there's all this tension, there's all this fuel. It's just a question of what's the spark going to be. But, I think Ahmad's absolutely right. We can't tell what kind of fire it's going to be and what will come out the other end of the fire.
May I ask you a question to David, John?
Yes, absolutely.
David, what do you think will happen with Israel itself? Israel itself, the entity, the people, the polity?
Honestly, I think this is the pressure cooker moment where Jewish Israelis who don't want to live in this kind of authoritarian, violent, manipulative state start potentially leaving again, which means the Orthodox right wing in Israel become more and more and more and more powerful, and that because they can see the Arab world seething around them, they will have to coalesce into something more willing and more capable to use violence, use power, so that we do end up with the tectonic plate idea I mentioned before, where I really can't see, where you sort of said maybe 20, 30 years before the Arab world coalesces. I think Israel will coalesce into something nastier very quickly, and that will give the rest of the world very little choice but to go, this is just going to be awful, because Israel will go, everything around us is anger, everything around us is uncertainty. The Iranians are taking advantage of this constantly. The Turkish may be able to take advantage of this. The Saudis will keep finding a way to use power. What happens with little places like Qatar? Who knows? But Israel's neighbourhood is only going to get more dangerous for it. And people in Israel who don't want to be a part of this will move back to America, will arrive in Sydney, will move to Europe. And gradually all we will have is rage and uncertainty on either side of this divide in Israel. And I'm beyond the point anymore of seeing how it can be anything but a conflagration, which is an awful place to have to get.
Imad and David, if I can just ask this question of both of you. It seems unlikely in this present state of affairs that Muslim people, especially Palestinians, will have free access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, an extremely important holy site to all Muslims. Can Israel, a partisan Jewish state, ever really be considered a good custodian of the religious rights of Muslims when Muslims are considered the implacable enemy surrounding Israel? Imad, you want to have a crack first?
Well, Israel has prided itself that, it has supposedly kept the holy places, the holy sites open to everybody, except that, the Muslims don't feel that way, really. The Muslims feel that they are prevented from free access to the Haram Sharif, and also are afraid that Messianic Jews and really Orthodox Jews want to really build that temple on the Temple Mount. So it's a problem for everybody. Going back to what David just said, the problem that may really make everything just simply blow up is the issue that Israel is steadily walking towards the Jewish Republic of Israel, just like the Islamic Republic of Iran. I mean, they are beginning to think in Talmudic terms. They want to do the Jewish Sharia in Israel. So, if that were to happen, if the state becomes more religious, there is nothing that prevents Israel from saying, "Hey, forget it. We don't have any Al-Aqsa Mosque. We don't have anything like that, and we're rebuilding the temple." So, if that were to happen, the conflagration that David is talking about is sure to happen.
Yeah, David.
I am so afraid that the Israelis, where they've only ever been just good enough custodians to keep the world on side, are just going to feel less and less purpose to do it, because they now have authorization to make Jerusalem their capital, which means they can begin to discount everyone and everything else, going, we have what we want, we are meant to be the persecuted people, we are meant to suffer, and then there is meant to be a great final battle. And if secular people start leaving and reasonable people start leaving, who's going to counter this growing pressure? And if the settler movement just keeps being so pressurised and exposed to violence, traumatised people behave in traumatic ways, we're moving down a path of trauma will be the defining characteristic, not goodwill or humanity or any concept of human universality. It seems if we don't somehow affect this in the next year or so, the idea of any universal good behaviour, leaving sites open for all people to appreciate and engage with, will just gradually slip away.
Is there a possibility that once all the anger in the streets of the West Bank and Gaza has been fully exhausted, cooler assessment of the situation will happen and the Muslim capitals will, that they'll have to keep their doors open to the US irrespective of what they may or may not think of Donald Trump or even of Israel? So pragmatism, after all, is the ultimate political guide. Or is what we are actually seeing really what you guys are saying? And that is that there is now this extraordinary situation. The old order is being gradually swept away. The new order, which is, as Imad said, very fluid and has a while to actually try to figure itself out, although, as David said, in Israel, it may be a very truncated time. But, ultimately, it's easy when you see uncertainty to take an apocalyptic view. But the reality of the situation is that once some bloodletting has taken place, a pattern of, well, okay, we're all exhausted now, let's all go home and, grumble in our cups of tea over this situation because we can't take it to that next level. I mean, is there not also that needs to be considered as well, that pragmatism will ultimately be the thing that caps the potential for this awful apocalyptic violent surge? Imad?
I don't know. I mean, once ideology sets in, once ideology takes precedence to politics is the art of the possible. Ideology is the art of ideology. Once it takes hold of politics, there isn't really much room for realism, for realpolitik thinking about these issues. The closer and the problem here is we're not only only fighting over a territory. It's not like only a nationalist project we're fighting over. We're also fighting over the Spirit of God. I mean, according to how everybody really believes God is. So once religious ideology takes over, I really honestly wonder how pragmatist anybody can be. Unfortunately, I mean, I might see pragmatism in probably the Palestinian camp, because they simply are the weaker party to this conflict. They have to be pragmatist because they can't be otherwise. They can't fight the battle. They can't win it. So I think the lack of pragmatism is on the Israeli side. And if the Israeli side continues to be so unpragmatic and continues to really say, well, it's the logic of power, then I don't see where they can really meet middle of the road.
David?
I absolutely agree that the Palestinians have no choice but to be pragmatic because of their position of weakness, and the Israelis just need to learn about pragmatism. But the other aspect of this, I think, is what happens in the Arab world broadly, is that regimes might be pragmatic, but the regimes are not powerful enough to make their people be pragmatic. And this difference about ideology rather than politics, you can jump back to sort of hardcore 1970s political theory here, to Ted Robert Gurr and his writing on expectations. At the moment, most of the Arab world hoped for better lives out of the Arab Spring. Their hopes were dashed. And Gurr always wrote that if your expectations for better are dashed, that's bad. But the second expectation being dashed is even worse. And that's your expectation that things should at least stay the same. So a lot of people in the Arab world were probably hoping, well, at least things can't get worse. Well, things just did. And when you can't have a better future and even your present is at risk, that's where the potential for ideology to become explosive really begins. It's not going to be better, and someone's even taking away the little we have. And that if people in the Arab world feel they're losing the little they have, so they may as well support the Palestinians and try and change the balance, and the Israelis still don't want to learn and understand pragmatism, this combination of different understandings of pragmatism and the inability to meet expectations of things being better, or at least not getting worse, becomes an ideological maelstrom.
Yeah.
Okay, gentlemen, I think that's a wrap for today. Imad and David, thanks very much for your time, and I'm wishing you both a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And no doubt, Imad and David, we will be in touch again. Well, actually, David, you and I have got another podcast next week, but Imad, we will speak to you and follow up on all these topics next year, yeah?
Thank you very much. And so you don't beat me. Yeah. Happy birthday on the 2nd of January.
Oh, well, thank you very much, and happy birthday to you on the 2nd of January. Thanks very much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hey, David. Bye.
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 This is Strategikon. I'm John Bruni, and that's the show for now. You can subscribe and download Strategikon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, and YouTube, as well as from sageinternational.org.au. If you want to know more about Sage International Australia, check out our pages on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and our website, sageinternational.org.au. And until next time, goodbye.